Hey, world history students. We're getting close to the end here, and today we're going to continue our talk with the Cold War in Unit 8, and specifically talk about the Cold War and decolonization in Asia, and specifically Korea and Vietnam, and U.S. and Soviet Union involvement there. So if you remember, after World War II, we still have a lot of countries gaining their independence. Almost all of the countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are becoming independent, and they're trying to decide, are they going to be communists, are they going to be capitalists, democracies, dictatorships, whatever it may be. And the US and Soviet Union were influencing those decisions. And we're going to talk more about how that happened. Today we're talking more specifically about Korea and Vietnam. During World War II, Korea was controlled by Japan and was forced to give that up after they lost the war. And so they're going to decide what they're going to be here soon. And also Vietnam was controlled by France at the time, and they are going to be divided up as well into North and South Vietnam to decide which one they want to be. Okay, so we're going to take a closer look at those. So if you remember from earlier, the Cold War is all about winning the hearts and minds of these newly independent countries. The world is divided up into three quote-unquote worlds. We have the first world, which are capitalist democracies like the US, Britain, France, etc. You got your communist countries like the Soviet Union and China. And then we have our third world, which are new countries or non-aligned countries that are newly independent, lower income, lesser developed, and we're trying to influence their decisions one way or the other to become capitalist or communist. And so there's going to be a lot of indirect fights or battles between the US and Soviet Union, known as proxy wars, one where they don't fight each other, but they fight on either side of an existing civil war. An example, we're going to fight with the South Koreans. The Soviet Union is going to support the North Koreans in the war. And so we don't directly fight each other, but it is nonetheless a competition, a battle for supremacy in the different regions around the world. Here's a quick map to show you what the first, second, and third world kind of looked like at the time. And so we're competing for to try to turn these red areas into either green first world countries, or we're trying to turn them into yellow second world countries if you're the Soviet Union, China. So specifically in Korea, they were forced to give up, Japan was forced to give up Korea after World War II. The United Nations forced them to have a free election to decide, are they going to be communists, which was popular in North Korea? Were they going to be capitalist, which was popular in South Korea? And luckily for the capitalists, it was a more populated area, and so they won the election to be democratic, okay, and capitalist as well. However, that didn't sit well with the North, and especially their leader in Kim Il-sung, who desperately wanted to be communist and have a united Korea that was communist. And so he began a civil war to protest the election results and force them to become communists. This was a uprising that was supported by the Soviet Union and China. Remember, they're communists as well. And they send weapons, supplies, money, all sorts of things to help them out, but not individual soldiers from each country. So it's just North Koreans fighting, but the US, SR, and China are helping them out. On the opposite side, you have the UN in the United States leading them, and they condemn Kim Il-sung, who you might remember as being the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And they say that the election results should stand and you have no right to take over this South Korea. And so they're going to send in troops to stop them. Okay, so the US and UN-led coalition try to push the communists back, which they do for the most part. They get them back to the 38th parallel, which is a line of latitude that separates North and South Korea. It looks like this. It's that line right here that goes through and separates the communist North from the capitalist South. And so they're able to drive the communists from the South back to the North. And at that time, they were contemplating going further north and wiping out North Korea and all the communists there. However, Mao Zedong, who you might remember from a previous unit, leader of China, Communist China at that time, stepped in and said if the U.S. UN forces cross the 38th parallel and try to invade North Korea, China would send troops in. And General MacArthur, who was the U.S. general at that time and led the UN forces, said that if the Chinese sent troops in, that the U.S. would slaughter them, and that it would be a huge mistake on their part. So obviously, General MacArthur is pretty confident that the U.S. would win, and that might set them up here for failure, for a rude awakening at least. So MacArthur and the U.S. send troops to try to take out the communists in the north. They cross that 38th parallel, and they fall into China's trap. China had 1 million volunteers on standby, and they sent them to help out the North Koreans. The U.S. and UN forces were forced to fall back to South Korea below the 38th parallel, and the communists were able to keep control of North Korea. The UN and U.S. forces have to switch to defense mode now and make sure they don't lose the South as well and keep up with that containment policy. Once they finally regain a foothold, MacArthur wants to try his hand again and take them out in the north. And this is a direct violation of Truman's orders. President Truman, if you remember, his policy is to contain communism. It is not to go out and seek to destroy communism where it already exists. He wants to prevent it from spreading. MacArthur wanted to destroy communism wherever it existed. And so MacArthur violated Truman's policy, and so Truman dismisses MacArthur and takes him out of command in Korea, forces them to retire. What ends up happening is it's a stalemate. Nobody wins. Korea is divided north and south still. They sign a armistice, which is not a peace treaty. They're still technically at war, but they've agreed to stop fighting. Still to this day, they have not signed a peace treaty, and North and South Korea are constantly at odds and on the brink of war. And that's what we see today. This is kind of what it looks like. North and South, communist North, capitalist democratic South, split at that 38th parallel, which is a line of latitude and separates it today. Here you can see the current border between the two. You have the South Koreans and the North Koreans on either side of this line, and it's very hostile still to this day. A lot of threats of nuclear war and things of that nature. All right, you have this guy who we talked about, Kim Il-sung, who is very volatile and protectionist and has to do a lot of things to display his power, especially nuclear-wise. And there are still ongoing conflicts today that we see on the news. So it's a highly contested and volatile region still today.